All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, November 22nd, 1910, a secret gathering is taking place on a secluded island off the coast of Georgia. This would be a 10-day affair on Jekyll Island, in which 6 very powerful men, many of them bankers, brought to the island at the invitation of a powerful senator, got together to talk about the financial system in the United States. At the end of the day, well, the foundations for what would become the Federal Reserve were laid. As were the foundations for the conspiracy-minded, because this was an actual group of bankers meeting under cloak and dagger on a secluded island, rigging the U.S. economy. You wonder where these conspiracy theories come from. But let's talk about these 10 days on Jekyll Island and the roots of the Fed. Here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Jacob Goldstein, former host of Planet Money, author of the book Money, The True Story of a Made-Up Thing. And since we last had you on the show, Jacob, you've moved over to our friends at Pushkin Industries, and you're hosting a show called What's Your Problem over there. So congrats on the new job, and thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you, and it's great to be here, respectively.
Yes. All right, so look, let me tell you where I started with this story. I was like, 10 days, starting November 20th, 1910. They were there for Thanksgiving. They put their families behind, went to an island with all dudes off the coast of Georgia to fix the U.S. economy. I don't know. I guess.
I like that it's this key moment in like the monetary history of the United States. And what you think of first is like, so did they eat turkey or was Thanksgiving?
Because I'm getting excited for Thanksgiving. This is running right around now.
Are you also planning to join a cabal to transform the nation's monetary policy?
Were they putting in their
It's a new
orders
holiday
for Black
tradition.
Friday?
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. Yeah, right. Did they invent Cyber Monday while they were at it? Funnily enough, one detail though, as I was looking at the story, they did have a Thanksgiving feast at the end of all of this as a reward for fixing the U.S. economy. So there you go. My question was answered. But let's talk about some of the details of who these folks were and how they got to this secluded island off the coast of Georgia. Then we'll take a step back, talk about the larger economic picture. But like when I said cloak and dagger in the intro, that really was what was going on here. This was a secret meeting.
It was a secret meeting by a very small group of extraordinarily powerful people, right? The sort of key mover behind it is a senator, Nelson Aldrich, who is rich, powerful, likes big business. And he gets together a bunch of really powerful bankers, the head of a national city bank, which I believe was the biggest bank in the country at the time, one of the key deputies of J.P. Morgan, who was the most powerful financial figure in the country at the time, this Harvard professor who's an assistant treasury secretary, who, by the way, doesn't even tell his boss, the secretary of the treasury, that he's going. It's so secret. And then it gets better. And by better, I mean worse, but by worse, I mean better, which is... So Aldrich, being the rich, whatever, it was 1910, being the rich 1910 guy he is, he has his private rail car, of course. So, of course, the cabal of bankers, I didn't even mention, there's a Jewish banker who has just moved to the country, which every conspiracy theory about central banking needs. So he's there too, a Warburg. So all of these bankers, they're in New York, and Aldrich has his private rail car hooked to the back of a train in New Jersey, just across the Hudson from New York. And they don't want anybody to know, right? These are all famous, powerful people. They don't want anybody to know that they're sneaking off. So he actually has them come one by one to meet, to file into the car, not in a group. More than that, he says, don't use last names because, they're famous. Everybody knows Warburg and Aldrich and whatever. And then he says, pretend like we're just duck hunters going duck hunting in Georgia. No, we're not going to be a secret cabal to transform the financial. We're going duck hunting. And so that's what they do.
They show up in their tweed and their khaki with their guns slung over their shoulders to go out to the country.
Yeah, one of them's got a shotgun.
A cloak and shotgun.
That's right.
Apparently, two of the fake first names. So they come to be referred to as the First Name Club because they don't use their last names. But apparently, they also gave themselves fake first names, including Orville and Wilbur, which to me, is more conspicuous. My name's Orville, and this is my friend Wilbur over here. I mean, if you're gonna pick fake names, pick. But do we need to know anything else about how they got there? What do we know about Jekyll Island? Rich person's retreat.
Jekyll Island it's a little island off the coast of Georgia. It's a private club that had been founded in the late 1800s. And if you can think of a famous rich guy from the turn of the 20th century, he was one of the members. Vanderbilt, Pulitzer, J.P. Morgan. Yeah. I think it was J.P. Morgan who sort of set them up with this spot.
Marshall Field.
And it was empty at this time of year, right? As it happened, there was nobody else there, which of course you need for your secret conspiracy theory.
Because all reasonable people are home at Thanksgiving with their family.
Having Thanksgiving, right.
For whatever reason, it was the off season. So there was still a staff there. It was a very deluxe resort where there were these sort of so-called cottages, which I think were actually like swanky houses. And then there's some kind of, nice, rich, in every sense of the word, dining hall. And, people did, in fact, go there to hunt. And so, as I understand, they were there and they were, doing this sort of finance, monetary policy work, but they were also eating oysters and deer and duck and, living well. Some of the guys would get up and go horseback riding or swimming in the mornings. I mean, in a way, it's like a monetary policy nerd's dream come true, which is to say my dream come true.
Like adult camp. That's what it is.
Yes, adult camp for rich people.
For very rich people. You could imagine it being called like Robber Baron Island. But I also have to say Jekyll Island is a pretty sinister sounding name if you're going to have your conspiracy theory somewhere.
Perfect.
Although, who was the bad one? Dr. Jekyll? Dr. Jekyll was the good one, right? Mr. Hyde?
Mr. Hyde.
So, yeah. We have this picture of, what they're doing down there. I suppose we should ask why they are being called there. Niki, I mean, what's the larger context is a very rocky economic picture. They have a specific question in front of them that they're going to try and accomplish. But, this is a moment of real up and down, right?
Right. I mean, the larger picture is that as the U.S. industrialized, it was racked with these periods of high-flying economic heat and very, very, very low depressions. Every 15 years or so, the U.S. economy would just fall off a cliff, and there would be this deep depression with high unemployment that would last for years and years. And it was getting so bad that it was taking some of these very wealthy Americans to bail out the banks because the U.S. government itself didn't have enough money to bail out the economy. And this had become untenable because a modern economy needed to have some sort of stability. And the idea behind creating a Federal Reserve was to help even things out and to get out of this boom and bust cycle that had defined the last third of the 19th century.
Yeah. And centralize a lot of this as well. I mean, if you think about at the time, there's over 27,000 banks across the country. Having some sort of unifying system that will keep all of the sort of checks and balances. I mean, if you think of banks as sort of these like mom and pop operations, that's really unwieldy if you're thinking about how to have more control and stability in the economy.
And, by this time, in Europe, they had to a significant degree, sort of figured out this problem, right? Obviously not entirely, but over the course of the 19th century in Europe, they realized that you could have this thing that came to be called a central bank. And, in particular, when we think of, say, the Fed now, we think mainly of inflation, right? And the Fed fights inflation. But there is another role that the central bank plays that was a huge deal in addressing those panics, those financial crises you were talking about. And that's what came to be called lender of last resort, right? There would be these recurrent panics. And there was one in 1907 that was ultimately the catalyst for this trip to Jekyll Island, where basically everybody would suddenly want to take their money out of the banks. All the banks would suddenly call in all their loans to each other. And whenever that happens, even if there's no real underlying problem to begin with, you have a really bad economic outcome because suddenly nobody can get their hands on money. You can't keep operating your business. You can't, just keep living your life because you can't get the money you need. And there was this insight. It was actually this an editor of The Economist magazine, weirdly, was the one who sort of figured it out. It had been this kind of bottom-up thing. The Bank of England had existed in England for a long time. But this guy, Walter Bagehot, who was an editor of The Economist, wrote at the end of the 1800s, like, look, you need a lender of last resort at these moments of panic. You need a central bank to lend to all these banks that are actually fine, right? They're not going to go bust. They just need money right now, and nobody will lend it to them. And so that was why we needed a central bank, and we didn't have one.
Well, and just to underscore something that Jacob was saying, like, other places had figured this out a long time ago. The U.S. system was pretty backward. And Warburg, who was one of the people who was at this meeting on Jekyll Island, he says in 1907 of the U.S. banking system that it was at about the same point that had been reached by Europe at the time of the Medicis and by Asia in all likelihood at the time of Hammurabi. So this idea that the U.S. banking system was a kind of backwater that needed to be modernized was a real impetus behind all of this.
It was a backwater, and that's the way we liked it.
Yes.
Because
I didn't want to change.
The U.S. had a central bank in the first half. Actually, we had two different central banks at the beginning of the 1800s, basically. And
we also saw Hamilton.
The second bank, Hamilton's was the first. And then there was a second one that Andrew Jackson killed, basically. And that shut down in 1836. And, there was the case against central banks was actually right there in both words, right? Central and bank are two words that Americans were wary of, right? It was this huge centralization of financial power. And so that was scary to people. People did not like that. And that was part of the reason it took so long.
So why do everything in secrecy? Is it in part because they thought if the public realized that they were plotting or scheming or even putting something like this together, that it would have a backfire? Essentially, there'd be too many hands in the pot wanting to decide what was going to happen. Or it was, if they thought that they could do this in secrecy, they could do it much quicker, and they didn't want to alert people to what they were doing. I'm trying to figure out why the secrecy.
I think they didn't want people to know that it was cooked up by a bunch of bankers, basically, right? Because it was going to be a thing that Congress was going to pass. And so, like, Aldrich drafting it would be fine. But Aldrich and, like, all his banker buddies drafting it, that was not the look they were going for. So I think that was it.
And I think this is the moment right after the populist movement had mobilized so much anti-banking and anti-banker animus that it was a particularly bad look at this point in U.S. history.
I mean, and in fact, I don't know if this is getting ahead of things, but, they come back from Jekyll Island and Aldrich releases this plan. It's just my plan. No, I didn't go cook it up with a cabal of bankers on a secret island. And in fact, it doesn't pass, right? They come up with this plan, and it is this weird plan. And one of the things that's interesting, so today there are these Federal Reserve banks in cities all around the country. There's something like a dozen of them. There's one in New York, and there's one in St. Louis, and there's one in, Richmond, and there's one in Boston and there's one in Minneapolis. I won't go on, but there's a lot of them. And so that actually does go back to this Jekyll Island plan, because as we were talking about before, there was this great fear of centralized power. So part of their idea was like, okay, we won't centralize it. There won't be one central bank in New York or Washington. There'll be little not so central banks all around the country. And that was trying to address this American sensibility. And the Aldrich plan, the Jekyll Island plan, doesn't ultimately pass. Aldrich is a Republican. The Republicans lose power. The Democrats come in. And eventually the Democrats, the party of Andrew Jackson, who killed the central bank, wind up passing the bill a few years later that creates what becomes the Fed. But it does keep that decentralized structure. And it works that way for a while. It ends up not working very well in the Depression. And today it's a much more centralized system. But that core idea of can we do this without it being so central, that was really important.
And so to lay out the basics, right, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Jacob, but the proposal that, as you said, was modified over the next number of years, but we would have these 15 banks. They'd be responsible for holding the reserve of member banks, issue currency, discount commercial paper, transfer balances, check clearing collection, basically be a backstop in the way that you described. Do you have a sense of whether there was a competing vision, or was it just kind of let's work out the details of this thing that we all agree kind of needs to happen at this moment?
I mean, I don't think anybody was like, why are you screwing around? Just have a regular central bank. I don't think, I'm not aware of somebody making that case. I mean, one big change, one big thing that you wouldn't even think of today was their initial proposal was for these, they called them reserve associations, but basically these regional central banks, these regional feds, to be private banks, right? Not government banks. And, the Bank of England, which is probably the most famous, the most important central bank up to this point, was a private bank, which is weird to us today, right? Because the central bank is like part of the government. And so one of the big changes from their original proposal, from the Jekyll Island proposal, to what ultimately passed was Congress. And, once the Democrats took power, they're like, no, we're not going to give private bankers this power of, creating money and controlling the nation's financial system. We are going to keep that power for the government. So that's a big, important shift that comes out of that debate.
Though I would say to many of us, we continue to be a little confused about where exactly the line is between federal oversight and these, and the Fed. And I think it is continually being sort of negotiated and worked around.
Right. And there is, there is this idea of central bank independence, right? Where the Fed doesn't feel like the government, even though it is sort of, right? And that's kind of deliberate, right? I think there has been a choice, really, a policy choice, which is, to make the Fed more technocratic, so that, the basic idea is we don't want Congress deciding what interest rates should be, right? I think that was the decision, and we can debate whether that's good or bad, but that is the decision we've made. Seems like a reasonable call to me, frankly, but I could see a counter argument if you wanted to make it.
Have you met Congress? It's probably a pretty good idea.
So you hinted at this, but the folks who were down there on this island stayed quiet for 20 years about this meeting, and for the reasons that we described, and it still got held up in a political process. It doesn't come out until about 20 years later, and Aldrich publishes a biography. There's a mention of it in there, but then there's also a publication in 1927 of Carter Glass's memoir, the name of which was An Adventure in Constructive Finance. I just love that name. Your book, Jacob, has a much better title than that. But I suppose if you're a banker, that's what you're going to call your memoirs.
So Carter Glass was actually he wasn't there, to be clear. He was the Democratic politician who wound up getting the ultimate bill passed that created the Fed, but he must have known the backstory.
He claims credit for it, and then the details come out, and then everyone's like, okay, yes.
I think one of the bankers who was there wrote a magazine article much later. There's a few descriptions of here. Wait, I'm just going to find it. I quote a little bit of it in the book because it's just sort of this this moment that we had talked about. That is this day. In Esoteric Political History Day, right? When they go to get on the branding, when they go to get on the train, right? And one of them, in this magazine article, he writes, when I came to that car, the blinds were down and only slender threads of amber light showed the shape of the windows. It's super cheesy, but kind of awesome, maybe?
Yeah, it's really evocative of this, cloak and dagger kind of.
Cloak and
setting.
shotgun, cloak and shotgun.
Agatha Christie Clue vibes for sure. But okay, so since we've come back around to the cloak and dagger thing, I mean, I am curious your thoughts on kind of like how, whether you know specifically what kind of conspiracies this has spawned, or just how it taps into larger conspiracies, and also maybe in there you can also talk a little bit about the fact that, like, to me, I don't think 5 bankers go down to a secluded island to all talk with each other if there isn't some self-interest there, right? They're not just doing it, I would imagine, as like, well, mom and pop are going to have a hard time when there's a bank run. There's got to be something in it for them, right? So, like, what is the banker conspiracy air around all of this as you've seen it?
So there is a book that I should know more about called The Creature from Jekyll Island that I think is like a Fed skeptical or anti-Fed book, but I don't know the book that well. But it's a great name, right? Like clearly, clearly this action is handing Fed conspiracy theorists a platter of delicious things to, feast on. I mean, in terms of the self-interest, like, I do believe that it is possible for a thing to be in the interest of bankers and in the interest of everybody else, right? Which maybe makes me super naive or dumb or something.
Or one of them.
I actually, one of them. Right, sure, fair enough. But it seems clearly true to me. Like, I think we're better off having a central bank, and I think bankers are better off having a central bank. I mean, the thing is, like, a financial crisis is bad for banks and bad for everybody else, right? And that is part of what is so frustrating. I feel like everybody, rightly so, got really mad after 2008 because the banks got bailed out, right? And like, that is a very reasonable thing to be angry about. At the same time, everybody would have been worse off had the banks not been bailed out, right? And so that's like the sad version of the story. The happy version of the story.
Damned if you don't.
Yeah. I mean, the hope is that having a central bank means you don't have to do that so often, right? Having the knowledge that there is a lender of last resort standing behind the financial system means people are less likely to panic and to start that kind of collapse. And I think that's true.
And Jody, to the question of conspiracy theories, The Creature from Jekyll Island was written by a conspiracy theorist who writes about like chemtrails and things like that. But that book comes out in 1994, and it is central to all of these kind of not just anti-monetary, but like anti-globalization conspiracy theorists that really began to pick up in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, and then become part of like the world of conspiracies that somebody like Glenn Beck or Alex Jones traffic in. And so it does become really the heart of a number of big conspiratorial
and as the person in this conversation who has subjected themselves to much more Limbaugh and Jones and Beck than the rest of us, have you heard them? Have you heard them rant about Jekyll Island, or do they mostly focus on what's the one in California? Bohemian Grove.
Is that it?
That was Jones's big.
Yeah, that's it.
Bohemian Grove does come up more often, and I don't hear them talk a lot about Jekyll Island. But the Fed has just become this kind of container for all sorts of conspiracies.
All right. Well, we can leave it there, other than to say the Jekyll Island Club has closed down in the years since. But I am currently on Airbnb looking at some lovely houses on Jekyll Island. $159 a night for a house that sleeps 14 people. That seems very reasonable. You don't need to be a central banker to afford that.
It's more than enough people to transform monetary policy for a century.
Right.
So, I'm in.
Okay.
Fit two Feds in there.
Yeah,
I say a this day field trip.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm out.
Wow.
I can't.
So sad. You didn't even look at the pictures.
She's like $159 a night. I don't get out of bed for a place that isn't at least $600.
I see how it is.
No thanks.
All right. Well, Jacob, thank you so much for doing this. Happy Thanksgiving, I suppose. But your book is Money, the True Story of a Made-Up Thing, and the podcast with our friends at Pushkin is What's Your Problem? Thanks for coming back on the show.
It was really fun.
Yeah.
I'll come back any day.
Great. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.